Cast out by his billionaire father and replaced by a scheming half-brother, Thomas inherited nothing but a rotting farmhouse. Everyone laughed when he traded his tailored suits for a shovel. But the laughter died the moment his spade struck solid steel, unearthing a secret that would shatter a dynasty. Rain lashed against the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Arrington Enterprises boardroom, blurring the spectacular view of the Manhattan skyline. Inside, the atmosphere was even colder than the autumn storm raging over the city. Thomas Arrington stood at the end of the long mahogany table, his knuckles white as he gripped the leather back of his chair. He stared down his father, Richard Arrington, a man whose heart was as famously unyielding as the steel mills that had built their family fortune. For 10 years, Thomas had sacrificed his personal life, his weekends, and his youth to double the profit margins of the company's logistics division. He had done everything right, played by every rule, and desperately sought the approval of a father who viewed affection as a depreciating asset. Yet none of it mattered. Seated to Richard's right was Simon, Thomas's younger half-brother. Simon wore a pristine designer suit and a smirk that barely concealed his profound arrogance. Simon had spent his 20s drifting through European resorts and racking up scandals that the family's public relations team had to bury. Now, inexplicably, he was being handed the keys to the kingdom. Richard adjusted his gold tie clip, refusing to meet Thomas's eyes. He spoke in a flat, corporate monotone that made the absolute destruction of his son's future sound like a minor quarterly adjustment. The board has reached a consensus, Thomas. Effective immediately, Simon will be stepping in as the Chief Operating Officer of Arrington Enterprises. You will surrender your company credentials, your equity shares as outlined in the restructuring clause you signed last year, and the keys to the penthouse. Thomas felt the air leave his lungs. He had signed that restructuring clause under the explicit promise that it was a mere formality for tax purposes. It was a trap, meticulously laid by his own flesh and blood. "You're stripping me of everything?" Thomas's voice trembled with a mixture of rage and profound disbelief. After a decade of building this division, while Simon was busy making tabloid headlines, you are handing him a company he doesn't know how to run. Simon has a modern vision, Richard countered coldly, finally looking up. His eyes were devoid of any paternal warmth. You are a competent manager, Thomas, but you lack the ruthless edge this family requires to survive the next century. Furthermore, your continued presence would only undermine your brother's authority. You are severed from this family. Do not contact us. Do not expect a cent from my estate." Simon chuckled softly, leaning back in his chair and steepling his fingers. "Don't look so heartbroken, Tommy. I'm sure you'll land on your feet. Maybe you can find a nice middle management job in Ohio." Without another word, Thomas turned and walked out of the glass-walled boardroom. He did not pack up his desk. He did not say goodbye to his staff. He simply walked into the elevator and descended to the lobby, his life's work dissolving into nothingness. Out on the wet pavement, standing in the freezing rain, he realized he had roughly $4,000 in a personal checking account and no home. The next morning, as Thomas sat in a cheap diner nursing a terrible cup of coffee, a courier approached his booth and dropped a thick manila envelope onto the table. The return address belonged to Mitchell Barrett, a small-town lawyer from upstate. Confused, Thomas tore it open. Inside was a heavy, yellowed piece of parchment and a brief letter. It was a property deed. According to the letter, Thomas's maternal uncle, Gideon Croft, a man the Arrington family had completely ostracized and forbidden Thomas from ever mentioning, had passed away 3 months prior. Having caught wind of Thomas's impending corporate execution, Gideon had left his only nephew his entire estate. It was a 120-acre property known as Oakhaven Farm, located in the remote, heavily forested mountains of Vermont. With no other options and a burning desire to disappear from the world that had betrayed him, Thomas packed his few remaining personal possessions into his modest sedan and drove north. The journey took 8 hours, the polished highways eventually giving way to cracked asphalt, and finally to miles of winding dirt roads choked with overgrown pine trees. When he finally pulled up to the coordinates listed on the deed, his heart sank into his stomach. Oakhaven Farm was a nightmare of neglect. The main farmhouse was a towering Gothic structure of rotting grey wood, its roof sagging like the spine of a dying animal. The porch steps were collapsed, choked by thick, thorny vines that seemed to be actively swallowing the building. A short distance away stood a massive, dilapidated barn with a caved-in roof, and beside it a looming stone silo that looked more like a medieval guard tower than agricultural infrastructure. The entire property was cloaked in an oppressive, unnatural silence, broken only by the cold mountain wind whistling through the broken windows. Thomas stepped out of his car, his expensive leather shoes sinking immediately into the thick, freezing mud. He unlocked the front door with the rusty iron key provided in the envelope, the hinges screaming in protest. Inside, the house smelled of dust, dry rot, and abandonment. The furniture was draped in moth-eaten sheets, and the floorboards groaned ominously under his weight. As he wandered through the freezing rooms, tracing his fingers over the thick layer of grime on a forgotten dining table, a heavy sense of isolation washed over him. His father had cast him out into the cold, and Uncle Gideon had left him a graveyard. But as Thomas walked into the kitchen, he noticed something strange. The rest of the house was covered in decades of undisturbed dust, but the heavy oak floorboards near the rear door were scratched and scuffed, as if heavy objects had been repeatedly dragged across them recently. Furthermore, a massive iron deadbolt had been installed on the inside of the basement door, a lock designed not to keep intruders out, but to keep something locked inside. Exhausted, freezing, and entirely alone, Thomas wrapped himself in his winter coat and lay down on an old sofa, unaware that the ground beneath his feet held a secret that the most powerful men in the country had spent 30 years trying to erase. Sunlight pierced the grimy windows of the farmhouse, waking Thomas to a freezing, stiff reality. His breath plumed in the cold air of the living room. Every muscle in his body ached from the uncomfortable sofa, but a strange, foreign sense of determination had settled over him during the night. The corporate world was dead to him. The Arrington name was a poison he wanted out of his veins. He looked around the ruined room and made a silent vow. He was going to restore Oakhaven Farm. He would build something with his own 2 hands, far away from the toxic empire his father reigned over. By mid-morning, Thomas had driven into the small town of Oakhaven, a decaying logging community where strangers were eyed with overt suspicion. He purchased heavy work boots, thick canvas trousers, work gloves, and a variety of hand tools, draining a significant portion of his meager savings. While loading his supplies into the trunk, a weathered local man with a thick grey beard and grease-stained overalls approached him. "You the one who took over the old Croft place?" the man asked, his eyes narrowing. "I am," Thomas replied, extending a hand. "Thomas, I'm Gideon's nephew." The man didn't take his hand. "Derek Foley, run the local contracting outfit. I'd tell you welcome to town, but you won't be staying. Nobody stays at Oakhaven Farm. Your uncle was a paranoid lunatic who spent his last 10 years firing a shotgun at the trees. If you've got any sense, you'll sell that cursed dirt back to the county. and drive back to wherever you came from." "I'm not selling," Thomas said, his voice hardening. "In fact, I need to rent a backhoe for the weekend. I have a lot of clearing to do around the old silo." Derek's expression shifted from hostility to genuine alarm. "You stay away from the ground near that silo, boy. The soil's bad. Gideon wouldn't let anyone within 100 yards of that structure. Rented my equipment once, drove it himself, and threatened to kill me if I came up the driveway to check on him. I don't rent equipment for that property. Good luck to you." Derek spat on the ground and walked away. The bizarre interaction only fueled Thomas's curiosity. Returning to the farm, he changed into his new work clothes and grabbed a heavy steel shovel and a pickaxe. If he couldn't rent a machine, he would do it the hard way. He hiked up the gentle slope toward the looming stone silo. The ground surrounding it was heavily overgrown with thick, invasive weeds. But as Thomas began to hack away at the brush, he noticed something peculiar. The earth here was subtly uneven, marked by a massive, perfect rectangular depression, roughly 10 feet across. It didn't look like natural soil settling. It looked exactly like a filled-in excavation site. He drove the shovel into the dirt. For the first hour, the physical labor was agony. His soft, corporate hands blistered inside his gloves, and sweat soaked his shirt despite the bitter cold. But with every shovelful of dark, damp earth, the lingering anger toward his father and Simon fueled his strikes. He dug deeper, creating a trench 3 feet down, then 4. Just as the sun began to dip behind the tree line, casting long, eerie shadows across the farm, his shovel struck something hard. It wasn't a rock. It made a dull, metallic clank that echoed against the stone walls of the silo. Thomas froze, his heart hammering against his ribs. He dropped to his knees, using his gloved hands to frantically claw away the loose dirt. Buried exactly 4 feet beneath the surface was a massive military-grade steel lockbox, roughly the size of a large suitcase. It was heavily oxidized, covered in thick patches of orange rust, and secured by 3 heavy-duty padlocks. It took Thomas another hour of grueling labor to completely unearth the box and drag it out of the trench. It weighed nearly 100 pounds. Dragging it back to the farmhouse through the twilight, his mind raced with wild possibilities. Once inside, he locked the doors, drew the rotting curtains, and brought a heavy crowbar from his new toolset into the kitchen. Before he could strike the first padlock, his cell phone buzzed violently on the counter. The screen displayed an unknown number. Hesitantly, Thomas answered. "Thomas, it is Mitchell Barrett, your father's legal counsel." Thomas gripped the edge of the counter, his blood running cold. "I was told I was severed from the family. Why are you calling me?" "Your father has had a slight change of heart regarding your severance." The lawyer's voice was smooth, calculated, and entirely devoid of emotion. "We have been monitoring your movements. We are aware you have taken possession of Gideon Croft's property in Vermont. Richard is willing to offer you a one-time, non-negotiable sum of $2 million to purchase the Oakhaven deed from you immediately. A courier is standing by in the nearest town with the paperwork. You can sign tonight and walk away rich." Thomas stared at the rusted steel box sitting on his kitchen floor. His father, the man who had mercilessly stripped him of his career and inheritance less than 48 hours ago, was suddenly desperate to buy an abandoned, rotting farm in the middle of nowhere. $2 million for a farm that isn't worth $50,000, Thomas said softly. "Why, Mitchell? It is a generous gesture from a father who wants to see his son land on his feet. Do not look a gift horse in the mouth, Thomas. Sign the papers." The lawyer's tone had shifted from polite to subtly threatening. "The property isn't for sale," Thomas said, and immediately hung up the phone. He powered the device off completely. Breathing heavily, he turned his attention back to the lockbox. He wedged the crowbar under the hasp of the first padlock and threw his entire body weight into it. With a sharp crack, the rusted mechanism snapped. He repeated the process on the remaining 2 locks, his hands shaking violently. Taking a deep breath, Thomas threw open the heavy steel lid. Inside, the box was lined with waterproof canvas. Resting on top was a leather-bound ledger, its pages yellowed with age. Beneath the ledger lay tightly bundled stacks of $100 bills, easily hundreds of thousands of dollars in obsolete 1980s-era currency. But it was what sat beneath the money that made Thomas stumble backward in shock. Arranged in neat, heavy rows were dozens of solid gold bars, each stamped with the insignia of a Swiss bank that had been dissolved decades ago. Trembling, Thomas picked up the ledger and opened it to the first page. It was filled with meticulous, handwritten notes detailing offshore account numbers, bribe payments made to federal judges, and blackmail material. And at the very top of the page, in Uncle Gideon's unmistakable handwriting, was a single, terrifying sentence. "The Arrington Empire is built on blood, and I have buried the proof where Richard will never find it." Hours vanished as Thomas sat paralyzed on the cold kitchen floor, the glow of a solitary flashlight illuminating the yellowed pages of Gideon's ledger. With every turn of the page, the pristine, untouchable image of Arrington Enterprises crumbled into a grotesque mosaic of extortion, bribery, and blood. According to the meticulously dated entries, his father, Richard Arrington, had not built his empire through shrewd logistics and aggressive shipping contracts. Instead, the initial capital, the seed money that launched the entire dynasty, had been ruthlessly siphoned from a catastrophic pension fund collapse in the late 80s. Gideon's handwriting, sharp and precise, detailed how Richard had systematically destroyed the lives of hundreds of workers. There were names, dates, and account routing numbers linking Richard to offshore Cayman accounts. Worse still were the records of payoffs. Thomas read with mounting horror as he recognized the names of powerful, supposedly untouchable figures. U.S. District Judge Leonard Hastings, who had inexplicably dismissed a federal probe into the company in 1995, and William Prescott, a rival developer whose private plane had crashed under highly suspicious circumstances just days before a major merger. Gideon had been Richard's chief financial architect during those early years, the silent partner who manipulated the numbers. But when Gideon discovered the plane crash had been orchestrated by Richard's hired fixers, he had gathered the evidence, stolen the gold bars as collateral, and fled to Oakhaven Farm, feigning paranoid schizophrenia to keep the family's assassins at bay. A sudden, sharp crunch of gravel outside shattered the deathly silence of the farmhouse. Thomas instantly switched off the flashlight, plunging the kitchen into absolute darkness. He crept toward the grime-caked window and peered through a narrow slit in the rotting curtains. 2 matte black luxury SUVs had extinguished their headlights and were idling silently at the bottom of the muddy driveway. 4 men stepped out into the freezing rain. They did not look like local law enforcement or inquisitive neighbors. They wore dark, tactical jackets, and in the pale moonlight, Thomas caught the distinct, terrifying metallic gleam of suppressed firearms hanging by their sides. Mitchell Barrett's phone call had not been a mere negotiation. It had been a geolocation trace. His father had sent a cleanup crew. Panic seized Thomas's chest, tight and suffocating. He had nowhere to run. His sedan would never outpace those vehicles, and the surrounding woods were pitch black and freezing. His eyes darted desperately around the dark kitchen until they landed on the heavy iron deadbolt securing the basement door. Gideon's final secret. Moving with agonizing slowness to avoid creaking floorboards, Thomas grabbed the heavy canvas bag from the lockbox, stuffing the ledger, the cash, and as many gold bars as he could carry inside. He slung it over his shoulder, the immense weight nearly pulling him off balance, and gripped his steel crowbar. He unlocked the deadbolt, slipped into the pitch-black stairwell, and silently pulled the heavy oak door shut, locking it from the inside just as he heard the front door of the farmhouse violently splinter open. Heavy, muffled footsteps immediately began echoing above him. The men were sweeping the house, their suppressed flashlights cutting through the floorboards. Thomas descended the wooden stairs, feeling his way down into the frigid, damp darkness of the basement. The air here was thick and metallic. Reaching the bottom, he turned on his flashlight, shielding the beam with his hand. The basement was not a simple dirt cellar. It was a reinforced concrete bunker. Thick steel support beams braced the ceiling, and the walls were lined with heavy metal shelving units. But it was the far wall that made Thomas's breath catch in his throat. A massive industrial steel vault door, the kind used in commercial banks, was built directly into the bedrock. Next to it sat a complex radio frequency console and a massive diesel generator. Gideon hadn't just been hiding. He had been preparing for an apocalyptic war with Richard Arrington. Above him, the heavy thud of boots stopped directly over the basement stairwell. A muffled voice, calm and professional, filtered through the wood. "Boss, we have a deadbolt on this interior door, locked from the inside. Bring the breaching tools." Thomas's heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. He rushed to the vault door, gripping the heavy rotary combination dial. Beside the dial, scratched hastily into the steel with a sharp tool, were 6 numbers, the exact date of Thomas's mother's death. Tears pricked Thomas's eyes at the realization that his uncle had never stopped loving their family, even in exile. He spun the dial with trembling, frantic fingers. Left, right, left, a heavy, mechanical clack echoed through the concrete room, just as a deafening crash shook the ceiling above. The mercenaries were tearing the basement door off its hinges. Thomas threw his entire body weight against the vault lever. The massive steel door groaned, resisting for a terrifying second before swinging inward. He threw himself inside, dragging the heavy canvas bag with him, and slammed the vault shut behind him. He spun the interior locking wheel just as aggressive footsteps pounded down the wooden stairs. Safe inside the impenetrable steel room, Thomas hit a wall switch. A bank of harsh fluorescent lights flickered to life, revealing the true treasure of Oakhaven Farm. It wasn't just gold. The walls were plastered with blown-up photographs, surveillance logs, and audio cassette tapes neatly organized on wooden racks. It was a complete 30-year shadow dossier on the Arrington family's criminal enterprise. And sitting in the center of the room on a metal desk was a vintage, hard-wired rotary telephone connected directly to a buried underground copper line, a secure line that bypassed modern cellular towers completely. Thomas picked up the receiver. There was a dial tone. A slow, dangerous smile crept across his face. He was no longer the victim. He was the executioner. Dawn broke over the Manhattan skyline 3 days later, painting the glass facades of the financial district in hues of triumphant gold. Inside the grand ballroom of the Plaza Hotel, the atmosphere was electric. Richard Arrington was hosting the most significant press conference of his career to announce Arrington Enterprises' multi-billion-dollar merger with a European logistics conglomerate. The room was packed with hundreds of elite investors, politicians, and aggressive financial journalists. Simon Arrington stood at the podium, wearing a bespoke silk suit, basking in the flashbulbs of the press as he prepared to officially accept his role as Chief Operating Officer. "Today marks a new era for our family and our company," Simon projected into the microphone, his voice dripping with rehearsed charisma. "We are leaving the old ways behind and stepping into a future built on transparency, innovation, and global synergy." Richard sat off to the side in a velvet armchair, nodding approvingly. For the first time in decades, the billionaire felt completely secure. The cleanup crew had reported that Oakhaven Farm was abandoned, the basement vault impenetrable but silent. Thomas had seemingly vanished into the wilderness, too terrified to ever show his face again. "Excuse me, Simon, a question about transparency," a voice boomed from the back of the ballroom. The murmuring crowd parted like the Red Sea. Striding down the center aisle, flanked by 4 heavily armed U.S. Marshals and 2 grim-faced federal prosecutors, was Thomas. He was no longer wearing the muddy canvas work clothes of a frightened exile. He was dressed in a razor-sharp charcoal suit, his posture radiating an icy, unstoppable authority. In his right hand, he held a sleek black tablet. Simon's arrogant smirk faltered, his face draining of color. "Security!" Simon yelled into the microphone, his voice cracking. "Remove that man immediately!" The private security guards at the perimeter stepped forward, but the U.S. Marshals instantly raised their hands, flashing federal badges that stopped the guards dead in their tracks. "I think you'll want to hear this, Simon," Thomas said, his voice carrying effortlessly across the shocked ballroom. He stopped 10 feet from the podium and tapped the screen of his tablet. Every massive television monitor in the ballroom, which had been displaying the company's new logo, suddenly flickered. The screens shifted to display high-resolution scans of Gideon's ledger. The room fell into a deathly paralyzed silence as the indisputable evidence of bribery, extortion, and murder filled to the screens. Then, a scratchy, digitized audio recording began to play over the ballroom's state-of-the-art surround sound system. It was Richard Arrington's unmistakable, gravelly voice from 1995. "I don't care if Prescott has a wife and kids on that plane. The merger goes through on Monday. Take the engine out over the ocean and make sure Gideon burns the financial paper trail. No loose ends." Chaos erupted. Journalists began shouting frantically, camera flashes strobing like lightning. Investors leaped from their chairs in sheer panic, pulling out cell phones to frantically dump their Arrington stock before the market realized the company was a criminal front. Richard Arrington shot up from his chair, his face purple with absolute fury. "This is a fabrication, an AI deepfake. Thomas, you ungrateful, pathetic disappointment. I will see you rot in a federal penitentiary for this." Thomas stepped closer, his expression perfectly calm, a predator looking at trapped prey. "Actually, Richard, you're the one going away. You sent armed men to a property you didn't own. You violated a dozen federal RICO statutes, and I didn't come alone." From the shadows of the exit doors, Jonathan Weaver, the most feared United States attorney in the Southern District of New York, stepped forward with a squad of FBI agents. Weaver held up a thick stack of warrants. "Richard Arrington, you are under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, racketeering, and wire fraud. Simon Arrington, you are under arrest for accessory after the fact and corporate embezzlement." Simon backed away from the podium, his hands raised, tears welling in his eyes as he threw his father under the bus. "I didn't know. I swear I didn't know anything about the plane or the pension funds. He forced me into this." Richard stared at his youngest son in absolute disgust, realizing his legacy was entirely destroyed. Handcuffs were violently slapped onto Richard's wrists, pulling his arms behind his back. As the FBI dragged the screaming billionaire down the aisle, Richard locked eyes with Thomas one last time. There was no apology in his eyes, only the devastating realization that the son he had discarded had completely outplayed him. "You ruined the family name!" Richard spat venomously as they dragged him past. "No," Thomas replied softly, adjusting his jacket. "I purified it." By nightfall, Arrington Enterprises was in federal receivership, its stock price plummeting to zero. Simon, unable to cope with the reality of prison, had turned state's evidence, sobbing in an interrogation room as he confessed to every white-collar crime he had committed over the last decade. 6 months later, spring had finally come to Vermont. Thomas stood on the porch of the newly restored Oakhaven farm. The rotting wood had been replaced, the invasive vines cleared away, and the massive stone silo now proudly overlooked a beautiful, thriving apple orchard. With the legally acquired Swiss gold and the massive whistleblower bounty he received from the SEC, Thomas had transformed his uncle's lonely fortress into a breathtaking estate. He took a deep breath of the crisp mountain air, watching the sunrise over the pines. He had lost a toxic empire, but as he looked out over his land, completely free and fiercely independent, Thomas knew he had finally found his true inheritance. If you loved this story of ultimate revenge, hidden secrets, and jaw-dropping family drama, hit that like button right now. Don't forget to share this incredible journey with your friends who love a massive plot twist. Subscribe to our channel and ring the notification bell so you never miss out on our thrilling real-life dramatic tales. Leave a comment below. What would you have done if you found that lockbox? See you in the next video.